I thought I had buried my grief, tucked it away with the memories of a life I'd lost, until Ethan walked into my kitchen with a knowing smile and a secret in his eyes. One look, one word, and my carefully constructed world began to crumble. I never planned for this, never wanted this, but in that moment, I knew, life as I knew it was about to change forever. My life was once a picture of quiet stability, a well-organized world of routines and traditions that anchored me through every challenge. I was a wife, a stepmother, and a caretaker to a family that thrived on love and togetherness. That was before Bill, my husband, passed away 3 years ago. His heart attack was sudden, a cruel twist of fate that left me reeling, struggling to find my footing in a world that suddenly felt too large and empty. The house became a mausoleum of memories, echoing with the laughter and love we once shared. I filled my days with distractions, gardening, volunteering, even a book club, but nothing could ease the weight of loneliness that settled over me each night. The quiet hum of the house, once comforting, became a constant reminder of all I had lost. Then there was Ethan, Bill's son from his first marriage. At 28, he was the living embodiment of his father's best qualities: kind, driven, and quietly thoughtful. After Bill's death, Ethan made it a point to visit often, offering to help around the house or share a meal. I convinced myself it was his way of honoring Bill's memory, looking out for me as his father would have wanted. It was a comfort I desperately needed, a tether to a past I wasn't ready to let go of. But lately, something had shifted. Ethan's visits had taken on a different weight, his presence no longer just a reminder of the family I'd lost but something more complicated. I began noticing the way his gaze lingered when he thought I wasn't looking, the casual touches that sent shivers down my spine, the warmth in his smile that felt almost too personal. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, a symptom of my own loneliness. But deep down, I knew better. The truth was, I had started changing too. Late at night, I found myself searching for articles about grief and connection, diving down rabbit holes that made me confront emotions I wasn't ready to face. I told myself it was harmless, just curiosity, but when Ethan looked at me with those steady, knowing eyes, I felt a storm building inside me, one I wasn't sure I could control. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A glance held a fraction too long, a touch that lingered just enough to make my pulse quicken, or the faint smile Ethan would flash when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I told myself it was nothing, just my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. But the tension was there, building between us like a quiet hum beneath the surface. Ethan's visits became more frequent, his reasons often flimsy: a leaky faucet, a squeaky door hinge, or a simple check-in to see how I was doing. Each time, I welcomed his presence, grateful for the company. Yet, with each visit, the air between us grew heavier, charged with something unspoken. One evening, I found myself in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Ethan was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. The room was quiet except for the sound of dishes clinking against the sink. When I turned around, I caught him watching me, his gaze steady and intense. "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Nothing," he replied, but the corners of his mouth twitched into a faint smile. "You just seem different lately." "Different how?" I asked, my heart racing. He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know. Just different." I turned away, trying to mask the flush creeping up my neck. His words lingered in my mind long after he left that night. What did he mean? Did he sense the shift in me, the confusion and longing I was trying so hard to suppress? As the days passed, I became increasingly aware of how much I noticed him. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was frustrated, the way his laugh could light up the room, the way he looked at me like he could see straight through to the parts of me I kept hidden from everyone else. It was intoxicating and terrifying. But it wasn't just his behavior that unsettled me, it was mine. I started finding excuses to spend more time around him, lingering in rooms where he worked, asking questions that didn't need answers. Each interaction felt like walking a tightrope, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't define. One afternoon, as I passed by the living room, I saw him fixing a loose curtain rod. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms, and his expression was one of focused determination. I stood there for a moment, watching him before he noticed me. "Need something?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes locked on mine. "No," I said quickly, stepping back. "I was just passing by." He nodded, but his gaze lingered, making my stomach twist. I felt exposed, as though he could read the thoughts I was trying so desperately to bury. The breaking point came late one evening. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through the news on my phone, when Ethan sat down next to me. The space between us was small, far too small for comfort. "You've been quiet," he said softly. "Just tired," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it set my nerves on fire. I looked at him, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was something in his eyes, a question, a challenge, or maybe an invitation. I didn't know, and that terrified me. "Good night," I said abruptly, standing up and walking away before I could do something I'd regret. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't escape the truth. The tension between us wasn't going away. It was growing, consuming, pulling me into a place I wasn't sure I wanted to go. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more undeniable it became. The line between what was acceptable and what wasn't began to blur. I told myself it was innocent, that the fleeting moments, the shared glances, and the subtle touches didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better. Every interaction with Ethan felt heavier, more charged, as if we were both tiptoeing around an invisible boundary neither of us wanted to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. One evening, Ethan arrived unannounced, a toolbox in one hand and a small brown bag in the other. "I noticed the porch railing is loose," he said, flashing that easy smile of his. "Thought I'd take care of it." "You don't have to keep fixing things around here," I replied, though the warmth in my chest betrayed me. "I don't mind," he said, setting the bag on the counter. "Besides, I brought muffins. Thought you might like some." The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it filled a space inside me I hadn't realized was empty. As he worked outside, I found myself watching him through the kitchen window. His movements were precise, his focus unwavering, and I couldn't help but notice the strength in his arms as he tightened the screws. It was a sight that left my thoughts wandering to places they shouldn't. When he came back inside, sweaty and disheveled, he leaned against the counter, his grin still intact. "All done," he announced. "Thank you," I said softly, setting a plate of muffins on the table. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he replied, his eyes meeting mine. The way he looked at me, steady and unflinching, made my heart race. It was as if he was trying to say something without words, something I wasn't ready to hear. We ended up on the porch that evening, sipping wine as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass, and for a while, we just sat there, talking about nothing and everything. But even in the lightness of our conversation, the tension lingered, an undercurrent neither of us could ignore. At one point, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me. "You should get out of the house more," he said, his tone casual but his words deliberate. "What do you mean?" I asked, frowning slightly. He shrugged. "You've built your life around this house, around what feels safe. But there's a whole world out there. You deserve to see it." His words struck a nerve, stirring something deep within me, a mixture of longing and resistance. "This is my home," I said quietly. "It's where I feel grounded." "I get that," he replied, his voice softer now. "But maybe it's time to feel something more than just grounded." The way he said it, calm and deliberate, left me momentarily speechless. I looked away, focusing on my glass of wine, but his words stayed with me long after he left that evening. The next day, Ethan stopped by again, this time with a bottle of wine and a movie. "I figured we could take a break from reality," he said, his grin playful but his eyes serious. We settled on the couch, the movie playing in the background, though neither of us seemed to be paying attention. His arm brushed against mine as he reached for his glass, the contact sending a jolt through me. I glanced at him, and our eyes met, the air between us thick with unspoken words. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice betrayed me. "You seem distracted," he said, his gaze searching mine. "Is it about us?" The directness of his question made my heart race. "Ethan, I don't know what you mean," I said, though the tremor in my voice gave me away. I think you do, he said softly. And I think you feel it too. I opened my mouth to deny it, to push him away, but no words came. Instead, the space between us seemed to shrink, the pull between us undeniable. When his hand brushed against mine, I didn't move away. And when he leaned closer, his breath warm against my skin, I didn't stop him. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull back. But when I didn't, it deepened, becoming something neither of us could control. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, every doubt and hesitation dissolving in the warmth of his touch. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. We shouldn't, I whispered, though my words lacked conviction. I know, he said, his voice steady. But I can't help how I feel. Neither could I. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of his touch lingered, a constant reminder of the line we had crossed. I knew there was no going back, that what had started as an innocent connection had turned into something far more complicated. And while part of me was terrified of what it all meant, another part of me, one I wasn't ready to admit to, didn't want it to stop. It had been days since the kiss, but it lingered between us, a silent presence in every glance, every interaction, every breath we shared in the same space. I told myself it was a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by grief and loneliness. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced every time Ethan walked into the room, or the way my thoughts wandered to places they had no business going. Ethan, too, seemed different. His usual easy confidence had given way to a quieter, more deliberate demeanor. He didn't say much, but his presence felt heavier, his gaze more intense. It was as if he was waiting, for what? I wasn't sure. Perhaps he was waiting for me to make the next move, or perhaps he was just as lost as I was. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard his truck pull into the driveway. My stomach twisted with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I hadn't asked him to come over, but I wasn't surprised that he had. He seemed to find reasons to visit more often now, though we both pretended otherwise. "Hey," he said, stepping into the kitchen. He held up a small bag. "I brought dessert." "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile as I turned back to the stove. I could feel his eyes on me, and the air between us felt thick, charged with everything we weren't saying. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, his voice soft. "No, I've got it," I replied quickly, my hands trembling as I stirred the pot. I heard him move closer, the sound of his footsteps making my heart race. "You've been avoiding me," he said quietly. I froze, my grip tightening on the spoon. "I haven't," I lied, though we both knew it wasn't true. "Yes, you have," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "And I think we both know why." I turned to face him, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. "Ethan, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his voice filled with emotion. "Why are you so afraid to admit what's happening between us?" "Because it's wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "Because it's not supposed to be like this." "Who says it's wrong?" he asked, stepping closer. "Who decides what's right or wrong when it comes to how we feel?" I didn't have an answer. His words hung in the air, challenging everything I thought I knew. My mind raced with 1,000 reasons why this couldn't happen, why we needed to stop, but none of them felt strong enough to override the pull I felt toward him. Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a jolt through me that left me breathless. "I know you feel it too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see it in the way you look at me, the way you can't bring yourself to pull away." "Ethan, please," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "This isn't fair." "It's not about fair," he said, his gaze steady. "It's about what's real. And this, what's between us, is real." I felt my defenses crumbling, the walls I had built around myself shattering under the weight of his words. I wanted to fight it, to push him away, but I couldn't. Not when every part of me was screaming to let him in. The sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. We both turned to see Mark standing in the doorway, his expression one of confusion and suspicion. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes shifting between us. "Nothing," I said quickly, stepping back from Ethan. Ethan was just helping me with dinner. Mark's gaze lingered on us for a moment before he nodded slowly. All right, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe me. He set his briefcase down and headed upstairs, leaving us alone once again. Ethan let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. I should go, he said, his voice tight. Ethan, I began, but he shook his head. I'll see you later, he said, his tone clipped as he turned and walked out the door. The days that followed were unbearable. Mark's suspicion grew, though he never confronted me directly. Ethan stopped coming around, and I told myself it was for the best. But the silence, the absence of his presence, was suffocating. I found myself replaying our conversations, our moments together, over and over in my mind, each memory a mix of guilt and longing. Then one afternoon, Ethan showed up unannounced. I was in the garden, pulling weeds, when I heard his voice behind me. We need to talk, he said. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Ethan, I don't think. No, he interrupted, his tone firm. I'm done pretending this isn't happening. I care about you more than I should, and I know you feel the same. So tell me, what do you want? I stared at him, my chest tightening with a whirlwind of emotions. I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't know what I want. Yes, you do, he said, stepping closer. You're just too scared to say it. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I shook my head. This is too complicated. It's not just about us, it's about everything. About Mark, about the life we've built, about what people will think. None of that matters, he said, his voice soft but insistent. What matters is how we feel. And I know you feel it too. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt his hand on mine, warm and steady, grounding me in the moment. Just tell me the truth, he said. Do you care about me? Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I do. The words hung in the air, a confession that felt both freeing and devastating. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze locked on mine. Then that's all that matters. As his arms wrapped around me, pulling me into an embrace, I felt the weight of everything I'd been holding on to fall away. The world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of our breaths and the steady rhythm of our hearts. In that moment, nothing else mattered but us. The embrace we shared that afternoon in the garden was a turning point, one I couldn't ignore. But as much as it felt like a release, a surrender to something I had fought so hard against, it also marked the beginning of an unraveling I couldn't control. Ethan didn't come back that evening, and the silence of the house felt heavier than ever. Mark, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, chatted about his day over dinner, his voice a distant hum as my thoughts spiraled. Every time he smiled or reached across the table for the salt, a pang of guilt twisted in my chest, making it harder to meet his eyes. The next morning, Ethan texted me. His message was simple but carried the weight of everything unsaid: we need to talk. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity before replying, not now. I wasn't ready, and I didn't know if I ever would be. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between Ethan and me grew. He stopped coming around, and I buried myself in routines, trying to pretend that life could return to normal. But it wasn't normal, not with the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin, the sound of his voice replaying in my mind at night. Mark noticed the shift, though he didn't address it directly. Instead, his questions were subtle but pointed. Is everything all right? You've seemed distracted lately. I brushed him off with excuses, citing work or fatigue, but the cracks in our relationship were growing deeper. He didn't press, but the way he looked at me, searching, uncertain, made it clear that he suspected something was wrong. Then one evening, as Mark and I were settling into the living room to watch a movie, the doorbell rang. My stomach dropped as I opened the door to find Ethan standing there, his expression a mix of determination and hesitation. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't keep avoiding this, he said, his tone steady. I need to know where we stand. Who's at the door? Mark's voice called from the living room. It's Ethan, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. Mark appeared behind me, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Ethan, he said, his tone cool. What brings you by? I needed to talk to her, Ethan said, his gaze unwavering. Mark's expression shifted, suspicion flickering across his face. About what? The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan glanced at me, and I saw the question in his eyes, the unspoken plea for me to say something, to choose. But I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing, my mind a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and indecision. I think you should leave, Mark said finally, his voice firm. Ethan hesitated, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he nodded. All right, he said quietly. But this isn't over. As the door closed behind him, I felt the weight of Mark's gaze on me. What's going on? He asked, his voice sharp. What aren't you telling me? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too heavy, too complicated, and I didn't know how to explain it without tearing everything apart. Mark's frustration boiled over. I've seen the way you've been acting, he said, his voice rising. You've been distant, distracted, and now Ethan shows up here like this. What the hell is going on? I don't know, I whispered, tears spilling down my cheeks. I don't know how to explain it. Try, he said, his tone cold. But I couldn't. The silence stretched between us, thick with tension, until Mark shook his head and walked away, leaving me alone in the entryway, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like a stone. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. Mark's silence was icy, his interactions with me curt and distant. I knew I had broken something between us, something that might never be repaired. And though I wanted to reach out to him, to explain or apologize, I didn't know where to begin. As for Ethan, he stayed away, honoring the distance I had created. But his absence only made the ache in my chest grow stronger. I thought avoiding him would make it easier, but instead, it only amplified the void he had left behind. Then, one afternoon, I received a letter from him. It was short but heartfelt, his words raw and honest. I know this is messy, and I know I've made things harder for you. But I can't pretend that what I feel for you isn't real. If you ever feel the same, you know where to find me. I read the letter over and over, my heart torn between longing and loyalty. I wanted to run to him, to let myself feel the happiness he promised, but the weight of my choices and the consequences they carried held me back. In the end, I was left with a decision I wasn't ready to make, to continue living in the fractured life I had built, or to step into the unknown, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of everything felt like walking through the wreckage of a storm, pieces of my life scattered, some beyond repair. Mark and I existed under the same roof, but it was clear the foundation of our marriage had been irrevocably damaged. His once loving gaze was now clouded with doubt, and though we exchanged polite words and kept up appearances, the unspoken truth loomed between us, impossible to ignore. Ethan's letter sat tucked away in my nightstand drawer, its words burned into my memory. I read it every night, tracing the lines of his honesty and longing, feeling the pull of what he was offering, a chance to start over, to feel alive again. But alongside that pull was the weight of guilt, the fear of judgment, and the uncertainty of whether I could truly abandon the life I had built for something so uncertain. In the quiet moments, I reflected on how it had come to this. Losing Bill had left me broken in ways I hadn't fully understood. I had tried to rebuild myself, to fill the void with routines, with purpose, with people who depended on me. But in doing so, I had ignored the cracks, the parts of me that still ached for connection, for intimacy, for the chance to feel something more than just the safe monotony of survival. Ethan had seen those cracks, not as flaws, but as windows into who I really was. His presence had been both a salve and a mirror, forcing me to confront the parts of myself I had buried for so long. And though I hated the mess it had created, I couldn't deny the truth. He had made me feel alive again. One evening, as I sat in the garden, the sun setting in shades of orange and pink, Mark approached me. He stood in silence for a moment before finally speaking. I don't know what's happened between you and Ethan, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. But I do know this, we can't keep living like this. I nodded, my throat tight. I'm sorry, I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I never meant for things to end up this way. I know, he said, his gaze distant. But knowing doesn't make it easier. That conversation marked the beginning of the end. Over the next few weeks, Mark and I agreed to separate. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one that made sense. We had tried to hold on, to salvage what we could, but too much had been broken, and neither of us could pretend otherwise. As for Ethan, I didn't reach out to him, not at first. I needed time to process, to understand who I was outside of the relationships that had defined me for so long. I threw myself into therapy, volunteering, and rediscovering the parts of me I had neglected. It was painful, but it was necessary. Months later, I found myself standing outside Ethan's apartment, his letter in my hand. My heart raced as I knocked on the door, unsure of what I would say or how he would react. When he opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to something softer, more hopeful. "I didn't think I'd see you again," he said, his voice quiet. "Neither did I replied, my voice trembling. "But I realized something. For the first time in years, I'm choosing something for myself. Not out of guilt or obligation, but because it feels right." Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The relief and understanding in his eyes said it all. As I stepped inside, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges and doubts, but I knew I was finally moving forward, choosing to live, to feel, to embrace the uncertainty of the future. And for the first time in years, that was enough. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Do you think following your heart is worth risking everything you've built? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories that explore the deepest emotions and toughest choices. And stay tuned, the next story will leave you questioning the boundaries of love and loyalty.